So with your permission, Sam, we are now officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, welcome to this new Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogue co-organized with Greenpeace. We would like to start by thanking Greenpeace to have chosen our platform to present a newly commissioned global public opinion polling in 19 countries about supporting a strong and ambitious global plastics treaty. Those of you who regularly join us already know that the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogues kicked off in 2020 to make links with ongoing multilateral processes to tackle plastic pollution. This third series of dialogue started after the adoption 2 years ago of a historical resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly, setting up the path to a global treaty to end plastic pollution. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop this internationally legally binding instrument that was set up following the adoption of the resolution will meet for its fourth session, referred to as INC4, next week in Ottawa, Canada. And in the run-up to this negotiation, today's event will stress the importance of globally binding obligations to reduce plastic production, very important. In preparation for INC4, we have already hosted 9 dialogues discussing a key thematic and launching important documents to feed negotiators, and we will be hosting one more after this event. Let me also remind our audience that sorry, but somebody's speaking on the line. So let me remind you that the dialogues are organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Undergraduate Institute, IUCN, the governments of Norway and Switzerland, the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs, and the University of Geneva. Today's event will be moderated by Melissa Wong, who is struggling to join us online, who is a senior scientist at Greenpeace International. While we wait for Melissa to join the call, Sam, who is closely working with her, will be kicking off the event. Before I hand over the floor to Sam or Melissa, let me remind everyone that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event, will be made available on the webpage of this event. And throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. The transcript is also available in 100 languages, as indicated in the slide that you have now on the screen. And with that, Sam, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Diana, and thank you so much, esteemed colleagues. It's always a great pleasure to collaborate with the Geneva Environment Network, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today for this webinar on plastic production reduction, or more accurately, on primary plastic polymers production reduction, if we quote the language in the revised Zero draft related to the plastics treaty that's under negotiation. Just to briefly introduce myself, so as mentioned, my colleague Melissa, who is our senior scientist, is having some technical issues, so perhaps I can hand over to her after we've had our contributions from the member states. But for myself, my name is Sam Chetham-Welsh. I'm working as a senior policy advisor at Greenpeace, and I helped put together this webinar with our Geneva Environment Network colleagues and worked very closely on our polling. To kick off, the fourth session of the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee will be held in exactly 1 week's time to further develop an international legally binding instrument on plastics pollution based on a comprehensive approach that addresses the full life cycle of plastics under the UNEA 5.2 mandate. So we need a treaty that can catalyse the necessary systems changes across the full life cycle with strong provisions, not only on mid to downstream, but also upstream control measures. Many governments have expressed their views. The obligation on plastic production reduction has not been the easiest one, especially at the last INC in Nairobi. There have been clear divergence of political views on this potentially make or break provision, and that is exactly why we believe it's the time to provide a space for scientists to provide a scientific reality check and for global citizens to have their views represented on this scientific topic now. This is where this webinar comes from when delegates are doing their final stage of preparation prior to heading to Ottawa. We're very grateful to have a list of speakers joining today. They are going to talk us through the 3 parts of this webinar, from the perspectives of countries, scientific experts, and global citizens and civil society, respectively. aiming to provide a holistic picture across geographical regions and diverse backgrounds regarding the topic of plastic production reduction. I would encourage audiences who have questions to send them in the Q&A box, and we will endeavour to come back to them at the end of the session. So for our first opening remarks, each of whom will have 3 to 5 minutes, I'd like to invite all of our speakers to share why plastic production reduction is important for their country or region, and key messages they'd like to deliver for all delegates travelling to INC4. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to first introduce Ms. Juliette Kabera, the Director General of the Rwandan Environment Management Authority. Rwanda is the co-chair of the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution, which called for binding provisions to restrain and reduce production of primary plastic polymers in their recent joint ministerial statement for INC4. Juliette, why is plastic production reduction important for Rwanda? And are there messages that you would like to deliver to delegates as they head to Ottawa? I invite you to take the floor. You have between 3 and 5 minutes.
Thank you, Sam, for the kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, friends of the environment, good afternoon. Greetings from Kigali. It's a pleasure to join today's event to understand how the scientific community and the community at large are thinking about plastic production and what they want to see in the Global Plastic Treaty. Rwanda embarked on the journey to beat plastic pollution more than 20 years ago. Since then, we have learned that it's not a problem any country, any city or municipality can solve alone. Today, less than 10% of the world's plastic is recycled. That's how we know that we cannot recycle our way out of this problem. In Rwanda, we banned plastic bags in 2004 and single-use plastics in 2019. Today, it's hard to find plastic litter in the country, but that does not mean we are plastic-free. We recently launched a recycling scheme funded by a private investor levy, and so far, more than 1,700 tons of plastic have been collected. These are mostly plastics that we do not yet have the technical capacity to recycle. And this is a common story in many parts of the world. This is just one reason as to why Rwanda joined forces with Peru to propose the resolution that ultimately set us on the path to create a global legally binding treaty to end plastic pollution. To achieve this ambition goal, we need an approach that considers the full life cycle of plastic. This includes, and I want to stress, a reduction in plastic production. We do not solve climate change without reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We cannot solve biodiversity crisis without reducing habitat destruction. And we cannot solve plastic pollution crisis without reducing plastic production. Despite this, we are still some way from a shared understanding on how best to beat plastic pollution. That is why Rwanda and other members of the High Ambition Coalition are calling for binding provisions to restrain and reduce the production and consumption of primary plastic polymers to sustainable levels. We are also emphasizing the need to reach net zero greenhouse gas emission in the plastic system and align treaty provisions with the 1.5 degrees target of the Paris Agreement, as well as with the relevant targets of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, with the global framework on chemicals, and with the goals of the Basel, Rotterdam, and the Stockholm Conventions. While some may see this proposal as a risk, I wish to stress that re-imaging plastic production systems and innovating in plastics carries with it a huge potential and economic opportunities. We have seen this time and time again in a range of fields, from the Montreal Protocol on the CFCs and HFCs alternatives, and the Paris Agreement on the fossil fuel alternatives. By embracing change and moving quickly towards the cleaner, healthier future we deserve, all countries stand to benefit. At this coming INC4, Rwanda will be working alongside all member states to find consensus and ambition. I would like to thank the Geneva Environment Network and the Greenpeace for convening this event and for the important research that you've undertaken. The world is looking for leadership to solve the plastic pollution crisis. Let us answer the call. Thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Juliette, for sharing with us the perspective from Rwanda and bringing the greenhouse gas and climate perspective. And thank you very much for your solid commitment. Now let's move north to the European continent. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Louise Housseau, head of the Water, Pollution and Cross-Cutting Issues Unit from the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. France has been very vocal on this topic of plastic production reduction. Why this is important for France, Louise? And do you have any other messages you'd like to deliver to prepare delegates for the upcoming INC4? You have 3 to 5 minutes and the floor is yours, Louise.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you to UNEP-GEN and Greenpeace for this invitation and for organizing this webinar. As many of you may already know, France, as well as the other countries that are present today, is a member of the High Ambition Coalition, and our support for addressing the full life cycle of plastic, including through the production levels, has been made clear for a long time now. Juliette has presented very eloquently many reasons why we need to address production levels in the treaty. And I want just to reiterate and underline that addressing the full life cycle is absolutely necessary to end plastic pollution, which is the goal that we are looking at, because pollution starts as soon as production. And on the specific topic of the primary polymers plastics or PPP production, we need to listen to science. And science needs to inform the decision-making process. Countries that are the decision makers will be able to make better and stronger decisions if those decisions are well informed by science. Of course, countries will take other elements into consideration in their decision-making, but science needs to be one of those elements. And this is why France has hosted earlier this month a meeting with some countries to discuss the topic of PPP production. And we have decided to start this meeting by several scientific presentations, and those have been very enlightening for all of us. That's why it is really crucial to create spaces such as the ones we are in today. Not everyone is able to understand scientific studies, and I myself need translation from these studies. And we're very grateful for those who take the lead in making spaces for discussion between countries, scientists, and the general public. So thanks again to UNEP-GEN and Greenpeace, and as well thanking all of those who are taking time today to help us understanding the stakes that we are facing and to encourage a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louise, for bringing in the perspective from France and for reiterating the fact that pollution starts from primary plastic polymer production and the need to listen to science and scientists. We'll have some of them giving us a scientific reality check later into this session. Now let's move southwest across the Atlantic Ocean to the GRULAC region. We are grateful to have Ms. Valentina Sierra with us today, who is the permanent mission of Uruguay to the United Nations in Geneva. Hi, Valentina. I know you through the international chemical governance work, which may partly explain your work on chemicals of concern under INC. What's a nice surprise is that Uruguay goes a step even further upstream, supporting provisions on plastic production reduction. Why? What motivates Uruguay, a GRULAC country, to have this position? And is there any other message you'd like to share with INC delegates and stakeholders? The floor is yours, Valentina.
Hello, Melissa. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would like to start by thanking Greenpeace for this invitation and the Geneva Environment Network, of course, for organizing this timely webinar. It is a pleasure to be here with you, with such distinguished panelists and experts. And I also would like to take this opportunity to thank France for this workshop that took place some days ago in Paris on PPP. I think it was indeed very enriching, this exchange we had. And also it was exactly what we need, to hear the science, to be able to gather all this information and then to make informed decisions. The fourth session of the INC is starting next week, and we have a lot of work to do. Our focus will be on streamlining the revised draft text of the international legally binding instrument, in adopting a mandate for intersessional work, and in establishing a legal drafting group. It is time to elevate the ambition as much as possible, and after hearing the last scientific findings, we are convinced that the only way to achieve our goal to end plastic pollution by 2040 is by adopting strong global obligations based on a comprehensive approach that would address the full life cycle of plastics and would also promote their sustainable production and consumption. But this must be done by integrating at the same time a human rights approach that takes into account groups in vulnerable situations, including workers and informal workers, especially waste pickers. We know this is a reality in our region, especially with waste pickers face a lot of threats, a lot of harm by doing their work, and we must include them in this treaty. We also include a focus on the protection of human health and on the environment. When we say that we need to elevate the ambition, we mean that the plastic treaty must include obligations for reducing the production of primary plastic polymers. The science is clear. More production means more pollution. Also, we must effectively phase out or severely restrict the production and the use of specific polymers, chemicals, and plastic products that are harmful to the environment and to human health, that are problematic because they impede circularity or that they have a high risk to release into the environment. A non-toxic circular economy begins with the design of products that reduces material input, that avoids the use of toxic chemicals, and that enable reuse and recycling. To achieve it, access to information, transparency, and traceability will be key. At the same time, it must be secure that a potential replacement of polymers, chemicals, and plastic products by other kind of alternatives and substitutes will not lead to any comparable kind of harm or negative impact, and that they will be affordable and accessible to developing countries as ours. Finally, we encourage you, the scientists and experts, to fill the data gaps and to bring your inputs and expertise into the negotiation. We need you, and we need to translate them into provisions for this treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valentina, for bringing in the perspective from Uruguay and reminding us the need to elevate ambition while having substantial progress on the negotiation at INC4. Human rights, just transition, and waste pickers should not be forgotten in this process. Last but not least, for this part, let's move further west across the vast Pacific Ocean to Micronesia to listen to the message from Mr. Dennis Clare, delegation of the Federated States of Micronesia. Dennis, why a strong provision on plastics production reduction in the plastic treaty is so fundamental for your country and for PCIDS? What are the arguments the PCIDS have put forth so far, and what successful precedents that Micronesia has created which could provide an example for the INC negotiation? You have 3 to 5 minutes. The floor is yours, Dennis.
You're muted, Dennis.
Sorry. Thank you. And thank you to Geneva Environment Network and Greenpeace for hosting us. I think I'll start with a little history as to where we come from and to where our position is. In 2009, the Federated States of Micronesia proposed phasing down HFCs under the Montreal Protocol. We did this because HFCs were projected to grow enormously from then through 2050. And that's for several reasons, because we were phasing out HCFCs, because refrigeration demand was growing in the developing world, and of course, because refrigeration and air conditioning needs increase in a warming world. If not addressed, they were projected, these HFCs, to grow to about 10 gigatons a year, which is about 20% of our current global emissions and way more than we would be able to handle to achieve our goals in 2050. So the idea was simple. When you have too much of something that's intentionally made in factories, you can make less of it, and you can use less of it. So after 8 or so years of negotiations, made a little bit more complex by the ongoing climate negotiations, we agreed to phase down HFCs under the Montreal Protocol with the Kigali Amendment. So why am I raising this? Because the similarities of the HFC situation to the plastic situation are striking. Like HFCs, there are relatively few facilities in the world where plastics are made. These can be easily controlled upstream. Like HFCs, at least some uses of plastics have already cheaper, more sustainable alternatives that just need some support getting mainstream or getting into the streams of commerce. Like HFCs, if we don't limit production, our climate goals become impossible to achieve. This is also true, of course, for ending plastic pollution. Also, as with HFCs, a very small number of countries, including many vocal fossil fuel producers, are resistant to limit production. On the bright side, we did win that battle. Perhaps most positively, like those negotiations, I'm sitting here with a friend in Juliet and in Rwanda, which played obviously a critical leadership role in the agreement reached in their capital. Like the HFC negotiations, the small island states and African states and Latin American states are playing important leadership roles, especially in calling for production limits, for regulation of harmful chemicals, and of course for robust finance, which is another reason the Montreal Protocol has been so successful. Specifically, what have island states been calling for? First, we've been highlighting that we must live up to the agreed mandate to address the full life cycle of plastics in order to protect health and environment. Clearly, the full life cycle includes production of the stuff we're talking about, and it includes addressing harmful chemicals that are added. Of course, we also think it's important to deal with design and longevity and recyclability, waste management, remediation. These two are part of the life cycle, and it's all important. But there's no end to the increasing costs for waste management and remediation without reducing production. Unsustainable overproduction is at the root of these other challenges. Second, islands have emphasized that we will not pay with money or human resources to mop up someone's mess while they continue to profit from overrunning the taps. There's no equity in that. The fairness, the equity in any agreement or treaty is that we all come together to share the parts of the lift of the overall work. The balance of countries' efforts across different sectors and at different stages of the life cycle is part of an equitable approach. But those with the most resources and those furthest upstream, and therefore with the most leverage on the source, cannot just abandon their role and shift the burden downstream. This has been a point that islands have made. Islands are already overburdened, and they're looking to the treaty for relief, not for more homework or cleaning up others' messes. So to call for moving this issue downstream is a further burden shift when we need a balancing of burden. Finally, the simple point is unconstrained plastics production is a defeater for our agreed climate goals and plastics pollution goals. We simply cannot limit warming to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees if we do not control plastics production. And we cannot end plastics pollution without reducing the overproduction of plastics that otherwise will just continue to increase and increase pollution along with it. I hope that our further panelists can give more of the details of the math which has led us to these conclusions, but thank you again for allowing us to share our view.
Thank you very much, Dennis. That's excellent for reminding us the successful Montreal Protocol example on HFC reduction and elimination that Micronesia took lead on, and that we as INC community can learn from and build on further, as well as the equity angle in the production reduction. Thank you very much to all of our national delegates speakers for helping us understand where your country comes from in terms of upholding the calling for strong provisions to restrain and reduce plastics production despite very different national circumstances and capabilities. Naturally, the next question would be, what does the latest science tell us about why and how we should address plastics pollution and production? Without further ado, I would like to smoothly transition to the second part of this event and invite our distinguished scientist speakers to give us a short and sweet but critically important lecture on the science justification of plastic production reduction. Our first speaker at this session is Professor Bethany Carney-Amros, Professor of Ecotoxicology and Environment Science at University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and coordinator of the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty. The Scientist Coalition is a relatively very young network of scientists, but have already provided many valuable and independent inputs through their policy briefs, submissions, publications, events, and bilaterals since the very beginning of INC. So Bethany will be speaking on behalf of the Scientist Coalition today to help us set the scene on why plastic production reduction is so fundamental, imperative, and urgently needed for an effective plastic treaty. Bethany, you have 7 to 9 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to start just by thanking the organizers for the invitation to speak here on behalf of the Scientist Coalition, and to the previous speakers for their leadership in driving this global action and for their opening statements. So I'm going, as you already heard, I'm here representing the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, and I'm going to present to you a very brief introduction to the collected knowledge that we have around the need for plastic polymer reduction targets. And as you heard from Melissa, we are scientists, and we are standing not only on new and emerging science, but actually on decades of evidence on where we are in understanding plastics pollution and plastics as a material. But I'll start with a statement, and this is standing on and building on these decades of science, that the future of humanity depends on ambitious, legally binding global and national plastics production reduction targets. And to explain us through that statement, I'm going to start by defining what I'm talking about why we need these reduction targets and why we should be looking at production, and about how we might start approaching that. So on my first slide here, I'll put up a definition of virgin plastics or primary plastic polymers, PPP, that we already heard referred to by the previous speakers. And this definition can be found in the Scientist Coalition response to the revised Zero draft. So plastic materials are made of synthetic and semi-synthetic polymers that are used for the first time to create plastic products in any form. This includes thermoplastic, thermoset, elastomer, composite resins made from both bio-based and fossil fuel-based feedstocks. Now that's a very dense definition, but there's a few points I'd like to pick up in those words. One is that we are referring to both synthetic and semi-synthetic polymers. So synthetic would be those that are entirely man-made, while semi-synthetic are naturally occurring polymers that have been chemically altered to change their properties. An example of that would be cellulose acetate. And we're also referring to both fossil fuel-based feedstocks and bio-based feedstocks. So this is important. It's the very beginning of the plastics life cycle. Right now, the majority of plastics are produced from fossil-based feedstocks, but there are others that are produced from bio-based feedstocks, and we think these need to be addressed similarly throughout the treaty. And plastics are not just materials, they're not just polymers, they're very complex. They contain up to 16,000 different chemicals that are used in the production of plastics and products, and many of these are hazardous, persistent, and cumulative. More information about these 16,000 chemicals can be found in the new PlastChem report, led by Martin Wagner and colleagues. And some of those hazardous properties include properties such as being cancerogenic or reproductive toxic. They're persistent in the environment. They don't biodegrade. They accumulate through food chains. They accumulate in organisms. They can act as hormone disrupting chemicals, among others. And we also see that the plastics value chains are very complex. Now, I'm not expecting anyone to look in detail at this figure. It's from a publication 2018 by Levy and Cullen, depicting global flows of chemicals and petrochemicals. And this is showing us really about the high complexity of these value chains. More than 1,400 different kinds of products include plastics, and the markets are plagued by low transparency and significant knowledge gaps. There are other compounding factors, including financial. Oil and gas subsidies help to keep the prices of virgin products down, so falsely decreasing the prices of plastics, while other costs, the externalities, if you will, are paid for outside of the companies that are producing them by humans, by the environment. There's a low recycling potential for single-use and short-lived plastics. These are a significant volume of the plastics use, and they're not able to be recycled for the most part because of their design and use and escaping from our systems, so they're not sustainable. And we also know that downstream responses become more complex, more challenging, and more expensive in trying to address the plastics pollution problem. We see a lack of globally mandated criteria, assessments, standards, reporting, and compliance for plastics, chemicals, polymers, products, alternatives, substitutes, technology, systems, and services. So again, high complexity in what exactly we're talking about now. None of this is easy, but we're seeing that there are far too many non-essential plastics, chemicals, products, and so on. Many of them are hazardous and unsustainable, and there's insufficient information disclosure and traceability. All of this means that we are not able to manage what is being produced, and we're not able to mitigate harm. So reiterating, downstream measures will not be enough. Improving plastics removal, recycling, and other waste management technologies alone will never solve the global plastics pollution crisis. This has been shown repeatedly. I gave one example of a reference there. Winnie Lau, I think, will speak after me. She's another that has been showing this. Modeling work done by the OECD, among others, also shows that waste management will not suffice and that we must include upstream measures, starting with production. So the plastics pollution crisis can only ever be addressed if member states are collectively committed to dramatically reducing the global supply of hazardous and unsustainable plastics. So again, we're not asking to stop all plastics production. Plastics can be deemed essential materials with essential uses in our societies, but we need to address hazardous and unsustainable plastics. Again, we know that pollution is occurring throughout the plastics life cycle. On the left, you'll see an image from one of our outputs from the Scientist Coalition depicting the plastics life cycle. And we know that pollution is occurring at every stage, starting with extraction. And here you'll see a picture of a train wreck from a train that was transporting vinyl chloride, the monomer precursors to PVC production. We know that pellet spills occur. They occur at factory sites. They occur during transportation and other parts of the life cycle. We know that we have releases of chemicals and particles and waste materials from many of the uses of plastics. And as I said earlier, there's more than 1,000 different kinds of products that contain plastics. During the waste phase, we see release both from littering, from dump sites, from recycling technologies. And here I'm talking about particles, I'm talking about chemicals, I'm talking about greenhouse gases. And these releases are occurring throughout the entire life cycle of plastics. And we also have a global pollution of plastics in every part of the planet, including inside human bodies. So as science has advanced and as our technologies and analytical techniques have advanced, we've been able to identify plastics in human bodies, including in blood, in various tissues, in placenta, and more recently in plaques in arteries in the body. And there's emerging evidence. So this is some of the newer science that's coming out, showing us correlations and connections between micro nanoplastic exposure in human bodies and adverse health outcomes. But it's not only the particles that are problematic, but also the chemicals in plastics. And there is a substantial body of scientific evidence showing us that the chemicals in plastics are negatively impacting human health. The kinds of effects that we can document are on hormone disruption, reduced fertility, nervous system damage, cardiovascular disease, different kinds of cancers. These are all well documented, and there's strong evidence showing these connections. As I said earlier, plastics pollute the entire planet, and we're also starting to see evidence explaining how plastics are integral to the triple planetary crisis. This is a figure, again, from one of our fact sheets from the Scientist Coalition. And science is helping us to understand the mechanisms connecting plastics to climate change and how plastics contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, how plastics might be influencing biogeochemical cycles like carbon sequestration or albedo. We see connections between plastics and biodiversity loss, impacts on keystone species and habitat disturbances. And of course, plastics are central in pollution issues that we are facing globally. Oh, wait, I have to go back one slide, sorry. I'm just going to figure out how to back up. There we are. Nope. Controls. Okay, so this is another image that we produced, and this was based off of some of the studies that have come out looking at models on how much we would need to reduce plastic production reduction. And one of those numbers was 47%. And if we spread that out over the time that we have remaining between 2025 and 2040, which is the end goal for ending plastic pollution, we would need to reduce by 1 to 3% per year. And even if we are to reduce by that amount, we will still see an accumulation of plastics in the environment because of the cumulative nature of these materials. So this is not enough. This is not sufficient. The next question is, how are we going to do all of this? And again, you are starting to maybe understand, if you didn't already know, the complexity of the problem that we are facing. And this is how the Scientist Coalition is trying to frame this path forward. So our goal is human health and environmental health. We're trying to end plastic pollution. And there will need to be many different levers to do this, starting with the reduction of primary plastic polymer production. And here we can do this by looking to reduce non-essential plastics, non-essential polymers, chemicals, materials, products. We can look at reducing unsafe and unsustainable such polymers and products. We can look at increased transparency and responsibility throughout the life cycle and the value chains. We can look at improved compliance mechanisms. These will also include technology advances and financial mechanisms. And we can be inspired by sectoral precedents. As you've already heard numerous times, plastics are important and are used across different sectors. What we're asking for is integrated essentiality, safety, sustainability, and transparency criteria, where safety should be hazard-based rather than risk-based. We're looking for global binding PPP reduction targets supported by mandatory national PPP reduction targets that should be reflected in national plans. And we're asking for responses that reflect the waste hierarchy, starting with the regulation of extraction of feedstocks intended for the production of plastics, alternatives, and substitutes. So right at the very top of the waste hierarchy, where the first step is reduce. And finally, I'll end there with a thank you to all of the organizers and the speakers, and a QR code, which you can find our link, where you can find our link tree and all of our outputs thus far. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch, and we'll put you in touch with the right expert to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Bethany, for setting the very comprehensive scientific scene, especially by highlighting that the future of humanity depends on ambitious, legally binding global and national plastic production and reduction targets. I'm going to turn directly to Dr. Winnie Lau, Project Director for the Preventing Ocean Plastics Project at the Pew Charitable Trust. Among her broad portfolio, Winnie led the development of the famous Pew Report, Breaking the Plastic Wave, which made a huge wave in both the scientific community and the policy community regarding how to take concerted and holistic actions to reduce plastic pollution. It's more than a one-off project, but keeps updating and refining its models and suggestions based on the development of the latest science. Winnie will bring to us their latest scientific knowledge on how to end plastic pollution by 2040, which must be through a full life cycle approach. Winnie, you have 7 to 9 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Melissa, and hi to all of you. And I also want to thank the Environment and Geneva Environment Network and Greenpeace for the invitation to speak with you all today. So next, please. So over the last few years, after breaking the plastic wave, various reports and analyses have come out, and they all show a consensus that business as usual will lead to unsustainable growth in plastic production and pollution. And here I have shown the covers of Breaking the Plastic Wave, towards ending plastic pollution by 2040 from the Nordic Council of Ministers, as well as the report from OECD towards eliminating plastic pollution by 2040. Next, please. And according to the Nordic Council report, under a business as usual scenario, the annual production of virgin plastics will increase by 66% to 712 million metric tons by 2040. And as a result, the flow of plastic into the environment will nearly double to 49 million metric tons per year, severely impacting human health, livelihoods, and natural ecosystems. And on top of that, the associated greenhouse gas emissions will also increase by 63% to 3.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. However, there is hope, and there are pathways that can take us toward ending plastic pollution. All of these pathways, however, require action across the full life cycle of plastics and includes actions upstream, midstream, and downstream. Next. So from the research that Pew and Partners conducted, we found that action upstream in particular has the biggest impact on plastic pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. Most of you have seen by now this graph from Breaking the Plastic Wave, and it highlights the potential to reduce plastic pollution by different actions throughout the plastic life cycle under a system change scenario. And of all the actions, we found that reducing plastic production, such as through elimination, reuse, refill systems, redesign, can yield the biggest reduction in plastic pollution, nearly 1/3 among all of the actions. And it also provides the greatest opportunity to lower greenhouse gas emissions, since production and conversion of virgin plastic accounts for 90% of life cycle plastic emissions. And I haven't shown here, but we also looked at strategies that focused on downstream actions. And so, for example, a strategy that focused just on increasing recycling without any action upstream would result in still 18 million metric tons of plastics flowing into the ocean each year by 2040. Next. And our research further highlights that demand reduction isn't sufficient. So there are various provisions in the draft text of the treaty, such as those focused on avoidable and problematic plastics and product design, and that these can help reduce demand for plastics. However, on their own, they are unlikely to achieve the goal of ending plastic pollution by 2040. So for example, in Breaking the Plastic Wave, we looked at whether an item-by-item approach to reducing consumption, such as that under the EU Single-Use Plastic Directive, would be effective. And we found that even if all countries emulated and implemented the EU approach, next please, plastic leakage into the ocean would be reduced by only 15% compared to business as usual by 2040. Next, please. Another reason to tackle the life cycle of plastic is microplastics. As Bethany shared earlier, microplastics and nanoplastics are they're released throughout the life cycle of plastics. So here I've listed 6 sources of microplastics. 4 of these were covered in Breaking the Plastic Wave. Paint was added in the report that was done by the Nordic Council study. And we're also now looking at doing additional research on microplastics and nanoplastics generated during recycling. And what we found is that microplastics are a pervasive problem, and that the release, even from the very beginning of the plastic life cycle in the form of plastic pellets, and then throughout the use of products made out of plastic, such as textiles and microfibers that are shed while we're wearing and washing them, the personal care products, the microbeads that are in them, tires that release tire dust as we're driving, paint throughout its life cycle. And then now research is showing that the recycling process itself is generating microplastics and nanoplastics. So simply managing plastic at the end of its life cycle through recycling and disposing will not be enough, and that we will need to put in place measures to reduce the production of primary plastic polymers. And an instrument that mainly focuses on downstream solutions without meaningfully reducing production levels will not successfully meet its objectives. Next, please. So UNEA 514 is titled End Plastic Pollution towards an international legally binding instrument. So by now, multiple scientific studies have confirmed that a full life cycle approach is essential to meeting the goal of ending plastic pollution by 2040. These studies indicate that current levels of plastic production and consumption are exceeding the planetary boundaries, and that reduction is a critical lever in addressing greenhouse gas emissions as well. And it's only with the action across the entire life cycle of plastics, including reducing plastic production and consumption, that we can reduce plastic pollution significantly below today's levels towards ending plastic pollution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winnie, for being very concise and sweet, and for providing us a very clear picture of what is a full life cycle, why a full life cycle approach is important, and a clear and strong scientific conclusion that without measures to reduce plastic production, the treaty won't be able to meet the goal of ending plastic pollution by 2040. That's very clear. Thank you very much. Now I would like to turn to our third scientific speaker of this science panel, Ms. Eva Huchevska, Senior Officer from Greenpeace. Eva's team recently launched a flagship report of climate impacts of plastics at UNEA 6. She's going to bring to us the perspective of interlinkages between plastic production reduction and global climate change that has been mentioned many times by previous speakers. Eva, you have 7 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and good morning and good day, good afternoon to all participants. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this webinar. And I really would like to thank previous speakers, my co-speakers, for sharing their knowledge and experience on this particular matter. I will be speaking about global actions through the plastic life cycle, and you can turn to the next slide, please. Grid Arendal, as it was mentioned, has recently published the report Climate Impacts of Plastics, where we examine the latest scientific findings regarding greenhouse gas emissions at various stages of the plastic life cycle. In addition, we looked at the current plastic climate reporting efforts, particularly through the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement mechanisms. Thirdly, the report identified options for measures to maximize the climate benefits through the Global Plastic Instrument. So this presentation will speak to the findings of the report. Next slide, please. As it was mentioned numerous times, there is sufficient scientific evidence of the climate impacts of plastics. On the slide, you can see greenhouse gas emissions through the plastic life cycle, collectively estimated to be about 2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. This represents approximately 4% of global emissions. The figure on the slide illustrates the distribution of emissions attributed to each stage of the life cycle. Plastic production, being a high energy demanding process, is responsible for the highest amount, accounting for 85%. The waste management, encompassing emissions from recycling, incineration, landfilling, accounts for 6% of plastic-related greenhouse gases. Additionally, it is important to note that total amount are likely to be higher, as these calculations do not include emissions from the plastic use stages and other emissions. Moreover, unintended losses and leaks of methane to the atmosphere during the sourcing of raw material are also not included in these estimates. There is still knowledge gaps about open burning of plastic waste, for example. Next slide, please. Plastic production, as I already mentioned, is an energy-intensive process. We also attempted to distinguish between emissions which are directly attributed to sourcing of raw materials and plastic production and manufacturing, and those attributed indirectly. Plastic production involves refining, cracking, polymerization, and conversion processes. As you can see on the graphic, direct emissions account for less than a half of total emissions, at 41%. Indirect emissions of plastic production, manufacturing, are more significant than direct emissions. Indirect emissions arises from electricity generation, transport, fossil fuel extraction, and other sectors. Electricity generation, to boost all those plants, is often coal-based. This differentiation is very important for policy measures. It provides greater clarity on which control measures should fall under the new plastic instrument and which should be strengthened under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. The next slide, please. We have also outlined measures for optimizing climate benefits across the life cycle. We clearly delineated possible measures under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement and the plastic instrument. The measures under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement are more energy related. They could include activities aimed at decarbonizing operations across all stages of the life cycle. For instance, transitioning to renewable energy sources, or additionally, reducing emissions from transport and trade is also crucial. The plastic instrument presents a significant opportunity to address climate issues through material-related control measures. These measures could be more specific for each life cycle stage. Since the vast majority of emissions originate from the production and manufacturing stage, as we already heard previously, implementing these measures will result in higher climate benefits. Measures under the plastic instruments, such as reducing the use of primary polymers, increasing use of secondary plastics, minimizing the production of problematic, unnecessary, and avoidable plastics, or increasing the use of sustainable, safe, and low-carbon non-plastic substitute will result not only in lower plastic pollution, but also in lower greenhouse gas emissions. Another set of measures could be linked to sustainable design criteria during the manufacturing phase. These design criteria could focus on using low-carbon feedstocks, such as algae-based or fungi-based feedstocks, using polymers with lower energy requirements during production, and suitable for reuse and refill systems, and for mechanical recycling if it continues. Designing products with minimal microplastic releases in mind is also very important. Interventions related to reducing plastic consumption, for example, by incentivizing alternative delivery models will be beneficial for the climate during the plastic use stage. On the waste management stage, minimizing open burning of waste and preventing mismanaged plastic waste practices will also reduce emissions. It's also important to develop criteria to support the life cycle assessment of waste management facilities towards investment in low-emitting technologies. It is worth mentioning that incineration demonstrates the highest emissions of greenhouse gases when compared to recycling and landfilling. Therefore, it is important to avoid long-term carbon lock-ins with incineration technology. Lastly, continued remediation efforts are also important in the context of climate. These are only a few highlights of control measures to combat climate change and end plastic pollution. As I mentioned earlier, there is sufficient scientific evidence, and the plastic instrument offers a significant opportunity to respond to the climate crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eva, and congratulations to you and your team for this great piece of work, highlighting very specifically the connection between climate change and plastics and why plastic production reduction is critical in this context and to avoid carbon locking. Thank you very much, Bethany, Winnie, and Eva for helping us understand with a scientific, holistic, and life cycle approach why strong plastic production reduction provisions are such an imperative element for an effective plastic treaty. It's a bit unfortunate that a few other scientists would love to join us but cannot do as speakers today because their research is going to be published tomorrow or in the coming days. All these to be published new scientific publications share the same conclusion, including the daunting level of greenhouse gas emissions from the production stage of plastics, and the necessity and urgency to reduce plastic production for the benefit of addressing the plastic pollution and climate change challenges in a synergistic way. Despite the science being crystal clear that plastics production reduction is key to an effective plastic treaty, this provision is a very much politically challenging one through the negotiation. Greenpeace, as a campaign organization, wants to understand the public views about this topic, or more specifically, how much political positions aligned or deviated from their people's views in specific countries. Let me invite my colleague, Mr. Reham Dudayev, Senior Regional Campaign Strategist from Greenpeace Southeast Asia, to review our recent global polling results. Reham, you have 7 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Melissa, for the quick introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone around the world. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm Rehan from Indonesia, and I'm representing Greenpeace Southeast Asia. Tonight, I'll be sharing the valuable insight from our recent studies on public perception regarding the reduction of plastic production in the Global Plastic Treaty. Next slide, please. You might ask why it is important to poll the general public on plastic production. Firstly, there are many stakeholders involved in the treaty. However, the voice of those affected by its outcomes are yet to be represented. As we all know, the science around production reduction is now clear, but the conversation has become highly politicized, and we wanted to find out what the public expectation was for key member states in the process. Next, please. Yeah, the results were striking. There was overwhelming public support for the Global Plastic Treaty to cut plastic production and single-use plastics, advance reuse-based solutions, and address human health concerns. And next, how did we conduct this research? We surveyed almost 20,000 people from 19 different countries, and each country was represented by at least 1,000 participants. We used double opt-in panels for validity. This technique ensures answers came from humans, not robots. Next, please. Yeah, we polled 7 questions. Here's what we found. The first question, do you agree or disagree that to stop plastic pollution, we need to cut plastic production? Well, 82% of all participants agreed we should immediately cut plastic production. What a powerful insight. Next. And our analysis found the expectation of the public do not always align with member states' position. Support for production reduction is really strong in the global south. Yet, some of these countries, such as China and India, have spoken out against production limits. Instead, they angle for mere waste management. Many of the countries listed here are also importers of waste, including Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, despite having their own domestic waste management issues. Next, please. And question 2, 80% of participants supported plastic production reduction to stop biodiversity loss and limit climate change to an increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Next. The significant majority of emissions come from the production stage. Current modeling suggests that to be aligned with 1.5 degree compatible pathway, we need a huge cut to plastic production. Compared to 2019, across 2 regions, we require a 46% and a 70% decline in plastic production by 2050. Next one, the question 3. 75% of participants agreed to ban single-use plastic packaging to the treaty, which align with the national level policies such as Malaysia and Indonesia. Question 4, next one. 89% of participants thought that it is important to promote reusable and refillable packaging through the treaty. Next one. So strong support for reduction, reuse, and refill solutions were coming from the Philippines, Indonesia, Egypt, Brazil, India, Thailand, and Malaysia. And our other recent project report highlights the success of the reuse project in Quezon City, Philippines. This project introduced a refill system that increased consumer saving up to 200% and business profit up to 15%. Next, please. Next slide. Yeah. Question 6. As you might be aware, there were 143 fossil fuel and chemical industry lobbyists attending the INC3. Yet, we see here that 60% of the population are against their attendance. In India alone, over 51% of the public population believe for the treaty negotiation to be successful, fossil fuel and chemical industries should not be allowed to participate. This was echoed by Egypt and Thailand, among others. We have responsibility to the public, as neglecting public interests could bring legal implication or maladministration action upon member states. Next slide, please. Lastly, most of the participants were very concerned about human health impact of plastics. The highest support is from the Egyptian public, followed by Indonesia, South Africa, the Philippines, and Malaysia. Next slide, please. So, in conclusion, what does this mean for negotiators? The public expects a treaty aligned with 1.5 degrees. Greenpeace is proposing a target to reduce plastic production by at least 75% by 2040 from 2019 baseline to ensure the best chance of meeting the 1.5 degrees target and to address the full life cycle impact of plastic, that we believe this is aligned with precautionary principles. And also we need a binding global target, not NDCs, that further be elaborated by our colleagues from CL. And within the treaty text, we suggest to preserve obligation 1 with sub-option 2.1, a global target. This must be coupled with sub-option 1.1, how countries will achieve the target in the text. And member states must support intersessional work to discuss potential global targets, baseline reporting requirements. And thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Rehan, for bringing us the perspective of global citizens. The data suggests a strong global public expectation of an effective plastic treaty to be aligned with the 1.5 degrees target of Paris Agreement. In both global south and global north, it could only be achieved with strong provisions and binding global targets of plastic production reduction, which is also what global citizens believe as well. But how? How to translate the science case and the global citizens' expectations into such a politically challenging negotiation topic? I'm going to turn to our last speaker today, Ms. Daniela Duran, Senior Campaigner from the Center for International Environmental Law, CL, to provide a few key considerations of how a global production reduction target could be implemented within the treaty. Daniela, you have 7 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you to Greenpeace and to Jen for the invitation to this webinar, and thank you to the distinguished delegates that spoke before me and to my other co-panelists in this session. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. We've added a new layer to the discussion around the Plastics Treaty and around how to address and tackle plastic production in the Plastics Treaty. The public ask and the public perception about what the treaty needs to do. And this is a very, very important layer in the discussion. We now have the scientific evidence, as my colleagues from the Scientist Coalition have already showcased, and our colleagues from Grid Arendal and the others that spoke before me. We have the legal background because we've done it before. MEAs in the past have already addressed and tackled production. And now we have the public around the world asking our governments and our distinguished delegates to bring production to more sustainable levels to effectively end plastic pollution as UNEA Resolution 514 mandated. And as Gabriel Garcia Marquez would say, listening is the simplest way to learn. Listening to the science that is clear at this point that current production levels are unmanageable, listening to other MEAs that have addressed and tackled plastic production in the past, and listening to the fact that we just had the hottest year on record. Plastic production is affecting in a deeply, deeply concerning way climate, and we need to bring production to more sustainable levels. I was asked to talk a bit about how the treaty could actually achieve this goal of bringing production to more sustainable levels. And at CL, we've analyzed different multilateral environmental agreements that have done similar things in the past, controlling and limiting production and try to bring it to more sustainable levels. And we've analyzed the goods and the bads, the lessons learned that we can draw from these different MEAs. And we can say that the Plastics Treaty needs to do 5 things to actually bring production to more manageable levels, to actually have a treaty that it's aligned with the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement, and to actually have a treaty that enables any other solution in the life cycle, as my other co-panelists have highlighted. So first element, the treaty needs to incorporate an overarching obligation for countries to prevent and minimize the impacts of primary plastic polymer production. Let's not forget that plastic production is actually primary plastic polymers production. And this overarching obligation should cover the impacts that happen during the production of plastic precursors, such as monomers, which are an absolutely essential part of the plastics life cycle, and the feedstocks as well. Let's not forget that evidence is indicating that the majority of climate and toxic impacts of plastic production happen during monomer production. So we need an overarching obligation that serves as an umbrella for countries to actually take action to prevent and minimize these toxic and climate impacts. Second element, as my colleagues from Greenpeace have already mentioned, we need a global target for reducing the production of plastics progressively over time. These global targets need to serve as our guiding, as our northern stars, to indicate the way, to indicate our goal. And this global target will serve as a global benchmark for where do we need to walk and where do we need to arrive, and will serve as a tool to monitor progress of all of the actions of the treaty. At the very least, at CL, we believe that these global targets should express production levels that are aligned with the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement. As Bethany and Eva presented before me, plastic production could compromise the fulfillment of the Paris Agreement goals. We already have some studies and some evidence indicating that we need to substantively reduce plastic production to align this treaty with 1.5 goals. So this global target should express at a minimum production levels that are aligned with this climate goal. And why as a minimum? Because as Bethany already showcased before me, there are other impacts that we need to take into account, human health impacts, for example. The more production, the more microplastics that will be entering in our bodies, for example. So we need this global target to be able to be strengthened over time as new science emerges around which production levels could be more manageable and sustainable. But at the very least, 1.5 goal production levels aligned. Third key element that we need this treaty to have, we need an obligation for parties to take action at the national level to actually fulfill that target. And I'm going to use the words of another famous author, because sometimes others' words are better than our words, and it's those who cannot learn from their past are condemned to repeat it. We already know that nationally determined contributions, or as we put them in the Paris Agreement, were woefully insufficient to achieve the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement. We need another model, which fortunately we already have. Globally agreed national reduction targets, like the one put forward by the Montreal Protocol, which by the way has been framed as the most successful MEA of all times, can serve as a good tool for parties to take action at the national level to fulfill a global target. These are targets that increase progressively over time and that ensure the fulfillment of a collective global goal, and that can incorporate considerations of flexibility for developing countries, for example, and that right now are reflected in the zero draft in sub-option 1 of part 2.1 on primary plastic polymers. Fourth element, we need a list of common policy options, of common measures and actions that parties need to take to actually manage production and bring it to more sustainable levels to ensure that objective effectively happens. And that list needs to have, at the minimum, two key elements. First, to reduce, we need to first stop the expansion of production. Production is projected to grow exponentially, as my previous panelists have already showcased. So to start to reducing progressively and to bring production to more sustainable levels, we need to first stop the expansion of production, which, by the way, is being fueled by the construction of plastic production plants. In the next 5 years, we will construct more than 1,000 new plants to produce plastics. So this list of common elements should have a provision to stop the expansion of production capacity as a first step to prevent plastics from growing exponentially and to enable effective reductions over time. And second, the elimination of subsidies. Plastic production is highly subsidized at this point, so we really need to address this issue. And last but not least element is a mandatory reporting obligation. We have a huge information gap on where are we producing the polymers, how much polymers are we producing, which types of polymers. So to close that information gap, to enable informed decision-making, we need a mandatory reporting obligation on primary plastic polymers production that inform further decision by the governing body of the treaty and that close these information gaps and that enable monitoring progress and compliance of the treaty in the future. This is an absolutely essential element. And to close, my intervention, I want to bring an analogy, a comparison with the past, now that we're talking about learning from the mistakes of the past. At the UNFCCC, the climate negotiations, we already knew 30 years ago that fossil fuels were the main drivers of the climate crisis. We already know today that plastic production is a key driver of plastic pollution, a key driver of the triple planetary crisis. At the UNFCCC, it took them 30 years to realize that they should have addressed fossil fuels to effectively attain the climate crisis. Let's not find ourselves in 30 years from now saying, we should have addressed plastic production in the Plastics Treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for showing us an action-oriented how based on the what and why presented by earlier speakers. And I have noted down the 3 elements: stop expansion, remove subsidies, and mandatory. I hope I captured the points properly. Thank you very much, audience, for your patience. We might have 5 minutes for the speakers to respond to some questions. So I have questions that there are 2 questions I would like to raise here on behalf of the audience. One is, what are the primary reasons behind the increasing production of plastics? And the second one, which is related to that, is consumption drives production. Thus, focusing on production is looking at the wrong side of the equation because of that, and has UNEP or anyone has conducted any global study of various consumption or use of plastics by all polymer types. So I would like to pose this question to our scientist panelists, but if any other speakers would love to share some of your views, that will be great. And we have maybe 5 to 6 minutes to answer these 2 questions.
I'm so sorry, I was typing answers in the chat. I can't do 2 things at once. Could you repeat the questions?
So there are 2 interlinked questions. First one is, what are the primary reasons behind the increasing production? And second one is, does focusing on production is looking at the wrong side of the equation because consumption drives production?
If I could take a chance to answer the second half of that question, I would say that evidence shows quite the opposite, that the supply side right now is pushing production levels higher and creating markets. And this is something we've seen in the past through lock-in mechanisms where there has been investments in infrastructure and extractive practices, and a product needs to find a new home. And as global communities are shifting away from fossil fuels as an energy source, companies are investing in plastics production increases. Some numbers are that I've seen recently going up to 30% in some countries, 30% of fossil fuels, that is. And in doing so, they're creating new markets and trying to find ways to push plastics onto consumers. So I would say a lot of this problem is a supply side rather than a demand side, consumer-driven issue.
Thank you, Bethany. As Eva raising your hand, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it was a very good question and a very important question. And thank you, Bethany, for answering the second one. I also would like to echo your reply and also invite participants to look at our report where we point out about these imposed consumption patterns. So there is actually, it's not that consumers are asking to produce more. In fact, there is actually opposite what is happening. They are imposed to consume more, and most probably they can live without those unnecessary items that industry is offering to consumers. The same also for recycling patterns. We always say that recyclers are not. I mean, the households are not recycling well. This is a very similar answer to the question that the products are not meant for recycling and therefore cannot live longer than they do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eva. I see Dennis and Daniela raise their hands. So Dennis first, followed by Daniela, and then I think we might need to wrap up this Q&A session. Dennis, please.
Thank you. I thought I would just add anecdotally, and I think that was the perfect preceding comment, that I was in an airport last week and tried to get a bagel with butter, which I thought they would hand me a bagel with butter. I got a bagel in a little plastic bag in which there was a little plastic container with a little plastic top of butter. And then I got a plastic knife, and the plastic knife was wrapped in a little plastic cover, and the bagel inside the plastic bag was on a styrofoam plate. So there's like 5 or 6 items of plastic that I didn't have any interest in having that were handed to me when I asked for a piece of bread with butter. So I think that's indicative of the fact that demand is certainly not driving a lot of this production. Thank you.
Daniela, please.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, definitely I want to echo the answers of my fellow panelists and complement with an additional fact. And it's that we are already seeing an oversupply issue. So we have more capacity to produce plastics than the actual demand for plastics. So all of that oversupply is driving an overconsumption as well, because we need to allocate all of the excess of polymers that we are producing into new products. And I always bring this example, which some people might find funny, but the market of fake and artificial plants is growing as we implement bans of single-use plastics, for example, in several countries of the world. We have a multi-millionaire market for artificial plastic plants on the growth, because we need to find where to allocate this oversupply of polymers, and the options are infinite to actually do that. So we need supply-side measures in this treaty to actually address this overcapacity, this oversupply issue that we're facing right now, and that it's related with what I mentioned in my presentation, which is the construction of production plants that are adding to this problem of overcapacity that we are already seeing, that are highly dependent on fossil fuels as well. So we'll compromise our possibilities for a fossil-free future, which is a pressing need as well.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and to all of our speakers who have either answered questions here or through the Q&A boxes. We have also noted down all the questions, so we might be able to get back to you. And please feel free to outreach to our speakers in Ottawa or online for any follow-up discussions. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers today for your strong commitment, your solid message, and painting a very holistic picture, for helping us understand and inspiring us to think further about what it means in terms of provisions we need on global plastic production reduction to ensure an effective treaty. There are some shared threads of key information among all of our speakers, from government, from scientists, and from civil society, including one, the full life cycle includes all the way up to the extraction of fossil fuels and bio-based feedstocks for the production of primary plastic polymer. And 2, plastic pollution is an incredibly complex global problem, far beyond a waste problem, but rather much broader, including, for example, the greenhouse gas emissions, risking human health, environment, climate change, and biodiversity loss. Therefore, 3, binding strong provisions on plastics production reduction is imperative for an effective global plastic treaty, and the demand side provision alone will not be sufficient. I feel really privileged to gather such a great group of people with all kinds of expertise here today. The scientists and civil society delegates in the panel and their colleagues will be in Ottawa, doing their very best to support and inform critical decision-making with their knowledge and expertise, while also watching closely with global citizens the progress and your choice. Dear national delegates, plastic production reduction is one of the most, if not the only, difficult issue on the negotiation table, testing your commitment, intelligence, and ambition. Please do not fail the scientists and do not let your people down. Thank you. And I wish you a safe journey and see you all soon in Ottawa. Just before closing, I'd like to hand it back to Diana from Geneva Environment Network to give a few quick final announcements. Back to Diana.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and to everybody who joined the panel of this event. I think there are excellent food here for who will be negotiating in Ottawa in a few days. Thank you also for attendees. Just bringing to your attention that we will host an event in half an hour from now, where we will be addressing the last dialogue that we are hosting in the run-up to the INC4, where we will be discussing health-related issues with excellent panelists. So we hope to see you there also. And once more, really a warm thank to all, and also to Greenpeace for having proposed to host this event here. See you soon on the other call. As people are leaving, just reminding everybody, as mentioned in the chat, the summary, the video, everything will be available on the webpage of this event. Thank you.